Ambassador Sci-Fi Velnoon had spent 300 years talking species out of killing each other, and in all that time he had never once seen a delegation stand up in the middle of a Galactic Concord session and simply announce that war had already been decided. But that was exactly what the humans did. The emergency session had been called aboard the diplomatic station known as Meridian Threshold, a vast ring of metal and glass that hung in orbit around a neutral star, where no species held territory and no weapons were permitted beyond ceremonial blades. The 42 member species of the Concord had gathered because 3 frontier worlds belonging to the Solari Compact had been devoured by the Vashran Dominion in less than a standard week. The Solari were small, gentle, and completely incapable of defending themselves. They had joined the Concord specifically because they believed the Alliance would protect them, and now their colony worlds were burning. Vashran, an insectoid hegemony ruled by a hive queen with no interest in negotiation, had broadcast footage of the massacres across every open communication channel in the galaxy. It was not a cry for help. It was a warning. It said very clearly that anyone who interfered would suffer the same fate. Sci-Fi had watched the footage in his private quarters before the session. He had seen the Solari running through streets that were already on fire, their thin limbs flailing as Vashran drones descended on them like a living storm. He had closed the feed after 7 minutes because his hands would not stop shaking, and his people, the Aelori, had supposedly removed excessive fear responses from their biology 6,000 years ago. The session opened the way these things always opened. The Tuum delegation called for patience. The Orvani submitted a formal request for a sanctions committee. The Dreth wanted to send observers. The Aelori, Sci-Fi's own people. Response, with a timeline of no fewer than 18 months for fleet preparation and strategic modeling. War among the elder species was not something that happened quickly. It was planned over years, debated over decades, and executed with the slow, grinding certainty of a glacier moving across stone. That was how civilized species handled conflict. That was how it had always been done. Then the human delegation stood up. There were only 3 of them at the table, which was already unusual. Most species sent delegations of 12 or more, surrounded by advisors and analysts and protocol specialists. The humans had sent Ambassador Lena Vasquez, a military attaché named Colonel Wren, and a single translator who looked bored. Vasquez was a woman of average height, with dark hair pulled back tight, and eyes that seemed to be looking at something no one else in the room could see. She did not ask for the floor. She simply stood, and the room went quiet, because there was something in the way she held herself that made people stop talking. "Earth has seen the footage," she said, and her voice carried no emotion at all, which somehow made it worse than if she had been screaming. "We are not here to debate. We are here to inform the Concord that the 3rd, 7th, and 12th Sol expeditionary fleets will deploy to Solari space within 72 hours. We welcome any species that wishes to join us. We will proceed regardless." She sat down. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Sci-Fi had ever heard. Then the room exploded. 72 hours. The words bounced around the chamber like a projectile. The Tuum ambassador rose to his full height, which was considerable, and declared that no species in recorded history had mobilized a full interstellar offensive force in under 6 months. The Orvani delegation began running calculations on their wrist displays and shaking their heads. The Dreth ambassador simply laughed. He assumed it was a joke. It was not a joke. Sci-Fi watched Vasquez through all of this. She did not flinch. She did not argue. She did not even seem particularly interested in the chaos she had just created. She sat with her hands folded on the table and waited for the noise to die down, the way someone waits for rain to pass. The Concord's leadership held an emergency sidebar and decided that an observer must be placed with the human fleet. If the humans were truly going to do this mad thing, The galaxy needed eyes on them. Someone needed to watch, record, and report back. They chose Sci-Fi because he was old, because he was calm, and because he had a reputation for being impossible to rattle. Within 6 hours, he was aboard a human shuttle heading for the dreadnought UES Thermopylae, and he realized within the first 10 minutes that his reputation was about to be tested in ways he had never imagined. The shuttle docked, and he stepped into the ship, and the first thing he noticed was the noise. Human warships were loud, not with alarms or warnings, but with people. Crew members moved through corridors at a pace that bordered on running, calling to each other in sharp, efficient bursts, carrying equipment and datapads and weapons. The second thing he noticed was their faces. They were not afraid. Every species Sci-Fi had ever observed on the eve of war carried fear in their bodies. It showed in the way they moved, the way they spoke, the way they avoided eye contact. Fear was natural. Fear was sensible. Fear meant that a species understood what war actually was. The humans did not look afraid. They looked focused. They looked determined. Some of them were smiling, not with cruelty or bloodlust, but with a kind of fierce energy that Sci-Fi had no word for in his own language. It was the look of people who had been waiting for something and had finally been given permission to move. He was escorted to his quarters by a young officer who chatted pleasantly about the ship's amenities as if they were not about to fly into a war zone. When they arrived, the officer handed him a datapad and said it contained background reading that might help him understand the deployment. Sci-Fi opened the file. It was labeled Major Conflicts in Human History, Abridged Summary. He scrolled to the bottom to check the length. The file was 11,042 pages long. He stared at the screen for a very long time. Then he sat down slowly on the edge of the bed and placed his hands on his knees, and for the first time in his 300-year career as a diplomat, who had brokered peace between species that ate each other's young, Ambassador Sci-Fi Velnoon felt the cold and unmistakable thread of genuine fear wind its way through his chest. Not fear of the Vashran, fear of the species that was about to fight them. Sci-Fi did not sleep that first night aboard the Thermopylae, partly because the ship vibrated with a low constant hum that he could feel in his teeth, and partly because every time he closed his eyes, he saw the number 11,042, and could not make his brain stop calculating what kind of species would need that many pages to summarize only the major conflicts in its history. By the time he gave up on rest and ventured out into the corridors, it was what the humans called 0400, and the ship should have been quiet. It was not quiet. The Thermopylae was wide awake and moving with a rhythm that reminded Sci-Fi of a heartbeat, steady and relentless and impossible to stop. Crew members flowed through the halls in organized streams, each one knowing exactly where they were going and what they needed to do. He saw engineers hauling reactor components, pilots running final checks on strike craft, Marines loading ammunition into crates with a precision that seemed almost surgical, practiced speed that suggested they could do it blindfolded. He found Captain Elena Morrow on the bridge. She was a tall woman with short gray hair and a scar that ran from her left ear to her jaw, and she stood at the center of the command deck like a stone planted in a river, calm and unmovable, while information flowed around her from every direction. "Ambassador," she said, without looking up from her display, "you are welcome on my bridge at any time, but I should warn you that the next 60 hours will not be comfortable for observers." "I have observed wars before, Captain," Sci-Fi said. Morrow glanced at him then, and something moved behind her eyes. Not pity exactly, but something close to it. "Not like this one," she said. She was right. Over the next 2 days, Sci-Fi watched something that he would later describe in his classified report as the most frightening thing he had ever witnessed. And he had once stood in the same room as a Dreth warlord who was actively deciding whether to eat him. He watched humanity wake up for war. It was not a scramble. It was not chaos. It was a machine, vast and terrible and impossibly well-oiled, and it had clearly been waiting for this moment with the patience of a predator lying still in tall grass. Across the Sol system, from Earth to Mars to the frozen moons of Jupiter to the asteroid belt colonies, something called the Surge Doctrine activated. Sci-Fi requested access to the communication feeds and was granted it. And what he saw on those feeds made his stomach drop. Civilian factories on Earth were shifting to military production within hours. Not days, not weeks, hours. Assembly lines that had been producing agricultural equipment in the morning were stamping out missile casings by afternoon. The workers did not protest. They did not even seem surprised. They simply changed their tasks and kept working as if this was something they had always known they might be asked to do. On Mars, reserve soldiers were reporting to staging areas by the tens of thousands. They came from every kind of life: teachers, miners, doctors, engineers, and they arrived with their own gear already packed, because apparently human reservists kept deployment bags ready at all times, just in case. Logistics AI systems across the system rerouted cargo ships, reassigned fuel depots, and calculated supply lines to the Solari frontier, all within the first 12 hours. The coordination was so precise that Sci-Fi initially assumed it must have taken months of preparation. He asked Colonel Wren, the military attaché who had accompanied Vasquez at the Concord session, how long they had been planning this specific operation. Wren looked at him with genuine confusion and said, "We started planning it about 4 hours after the Vashren footage hit our intelligence networks." 4 hours. Sci-Fi asked how that was possible. Wren explained something called doctrine libraries. He said that the human military maintained thousands of pre-built strategic plans, covering virtually every conceivable type of enemy, environment, and scenario. When intelligence about the Vashren was fed into their planning systems, the AI cross-referenced existing playbooks for hive species tactics, swarm fleet formations, tunnel world sieges, and a dozen other categories that Sci-Fi had never even considered. And it produced a full operational strategy in 14 minutes. 14 minutes to plan a war that the Alori High Command would have spent 2 years preparing for. Your people, Sci-Fi said carefully, seem very practiced at this. Captain Morrow, who had overheard, answered from across the bridge without turning around. Ambassador, your species prepares for war when war arrives. We prepare for war because we know it will. The difference is about 10,000 years of learning the hard way. Hours walking through the ship and talking to crew members. He wanted to understand them, to find the cracks in this impossible efficiency, to locate the fear that he was certain must exist somewhere beneath the surface. He found fear. It was everywhere. The humans were not fearless at all. A young pilot told him her hands shook every time she climbed into her fighter. A Marine sergeant admitted that he had not been able to eat solid food since the deployment order came down. A communications officer said she had cried in the shower that morning. But they were all still working. They were all still moving forward. They carried their fear the way a person carries a heavy pack on a long march. It slowed them. It hurt them. But it did not stop them. Sci-Fi watched crew members recording messages for their families in small private booths near the mess hall. They spoke to cameras with steady voices, telling their children to be good, telling their partners they loved them, their parents not to worry. These were not final goodbyes, not exactly. They were routine. Many of them had done this before. Some of them had done it a dozen times or more. He stopped a young Marine in the corridor, a woman who could not have been older than 22, with bright eyes and a rifle slung over her shoulder that was nearly as tall as she was. "Are you scared?" he asked her. She smiled, and it was the most honest expression he had seen on any face in years. "Terrified," she said. "But that is sort of the point, sir." He did not understand what she meant. Not yet. The 72-hour mark arrived exactly on schedule, and Sci-Stories stood on the bridge of the Thermopylae and watched through the forward display as the human fleet assembled in formation around them. 814 warships. The Concorde had expected perhaps 40. The most optimistic projections from the Alori military analysts had predicted no more than 100. The idea that any species could field over 800 combat-ready vessels in 3 days was not just unprecedented, it was supposed to be impossible. The fleet stretched across the void in every direction, a wall of metal and light and barely contained violence, and every single ship reported ready at the same moment as if they had rehearsed this 1,000 times. They probably had. Admiral James Ewan's voice came over the fleet-wide channel, calm and clear, and carrying the weight of a species that had been fighting since before it learned to write. All ships. This is Fleet Command. Transition to FTL in 60 seconds. Destination is the Solari system of Keth Vora. We go to war for people we have never met, because that is who we are. Good hunting. The stars stretched and vanished, and the fleet was gone, and Sci-Story gripped the railing of the bridge and sent a single classified message to the Alori High Council on a priority channel that had not been used in 400 years. It read, "Recommend immediate revision of threat index for Sol species. Current classification, regional power level 4. Proposed reclassification, existential. They were ready before we asked." He received no response for 6 hours. When the reply finally came, it contained only 2 words. The fleet dropped out of FTL on the edge of the Keth Vora system, and Sci-Story had exactly 9 seconds to appreciate the cold beauty of an alien star before every alarm on the bridge began screaming at once. The Vashran were already here. They had expected resistance, of course, but the scale of what waited for them was staggering. The Vashran had committed a full sector fleet to the defense of their newly conquered territory, nearly 600 vessels arranged in the dense spiraling formation that Hive species favored, a pattern that looked almost organic, like a living thing floating in the dark. Sci-Story gripped the edge of his observer station and waited for the humans to do what every sensible military force in the galaxy would do in this situation. Pull back, assess, probe the enemy formation with long-range sensors, calculate firing solutions, run simulations. The Alori Doctrine Manual he had studied at the Academy recommended no fewer than 14 hours of pre-engagement analysis before committing to a major fleet action. Admiral Ewan gave exactly one order. All ships attack. The human fleet surged forward like a held breath finally released, and the void between the two forces lit up with weapons fire, so dense that Sci-Story's display could not render it all at once. He expected chaos. What he saw instead was something far more unsettling. The humans called it shock tempo, and Sci-Story spent the first 30 minutes of the battle convinced that the fleet had lost all coordination and was flying apart in a dozen different directions. It was only when he looked at the tactical overlay and saw the pattern emerging that he understood what was actually happening. They were hitting the Vashran from every angle simultaneously. Not randomly, not carelessly, but with a precision that was almost musical in its timing. Strike groups peeled off from the main formation and drove into the Vashran fleet at different points, each one targeting a specific cluster of enemy ships, and then pulling away before the Hive could respond. Bombers swept in low, under the plane of battle, and struck at the Vashran command vessels, while fighters drew the drone swarms away from the capital ships. The Vashran command structure was built around a hierarchy of signal relays, each one connected to the Hive Queen's central intelligence through a chain of subcommanders that coordinated the swarm in real time. It was efficient and it was powerful, and no species in the Concorde had ever found a reliable way to defeat it. The humans found one in the first hour. They had identified the signal relay ships buried inside the formation, the ones that linked the Hive Queen's commands to the individual drones. and they hit them with focus strikes that cut through the Vashran lines like a blade through silk. Every time a relay ship died, the drones around it went stupid, not dead, but confused, crashing into each other or simply stopping in place. Sci-Fi watched a cluster of 300 Vashran drones freeze in the middle of a combat maneuver and drift silently into the void as the relay that controlled them vanished in a bloom of white fire. "How did you know?" he asked Captain Morrow, who stood at her command station with her hands clasped behind her back, and her eyes moving across the tactical display with the calm focus of someone reading a familiar book. "Know what?" she said. "The signal relays, the weakness in their command structure. No one in the Concord has been able to map the Vashran hierarchy with enough detail to target those nodes." Morrow looked at him for just a moment, and something like amusement crossed her face. "We have fought hive-minded enemies before, Ambassador. Not aliens, not like this. But we have spent our entire history fighting things that swarm, things that outnumber us, things that move as one. Time ago, that you do not fight the swarm. You fight the thing that controls the swarm." The Battle of Kethvora lasted 9 hours. The Alori Military Academy had estimated that such an engagement would require a minimum of 3 weeks and would result in losses of 30 to 40% on both sides. The human losses were 4.2%. The Vashran losses were 61%. The rest of the Vashran fleet scattered into FTL and fled. But it was not the space battle that broke something inside Sci-Fi. It was what happened on the ground. Kethvora 3, the largest of the occupied Solari worlds, still had survivors. The Vashran had penned them in hive structures, massive organic buildings that grew from the ground like tumors, and they were using the captured Solari as living food stores for their larvae. The human Marines went in. Sci-Fi watched the ground feeds from the Thermopolis Intelligence Center, and what he saw was not the clean, precise efficiency of the space battle. It was something raw, something that came from a place he did not fully understand. The Marines dropped from orbit in armored pods that hit the surface like fists punching through a table. They landed in the ruins of what had been a Solari city, a place of delicate glass towers and gardens that was now a blackened wasteland covered in Vashran organic structures. And they came out of their pods already firing. He watched them move through the streets, and they were fast, terrifyingly fast, clearing buildings and intersections with a fluid coordination that required almost no verbal communication. They used hand signals, body movements, shared instincts built from training so intense that it had become something closer to a hive mind of their own, except theirs was held together not by signals, but by trust. Then they reached the first hive pen, and Sci-Fi saw the Solari inside, thin and shaking, and covered in the sticky residue of Vashran webbing, and he saw the faces of the Marines change. Something ignited behind their eyes. It was not rage exactly, although rage was part of it. It was not grief, although grief was there too. It was something that combined every sharp and burning emotion a living being could feel, and compressed it into a single white-hot point of purpose. A sergeant named Kowalski took a plasma burn to his left shoulder. The wound was deep enough that Sci-Fi could see the muscle beneath the skin, and the medical readout on his armor flagged him for immediate evacuation. He ignored it. He kept moving. He kicked open the wall of a hive pen with his good arm, and pulled 2 Solari children out of the webbing, and carried them to the extraction point before he allowed a medic to touch him. Sci-Fi contacted him on the ground channel afterward and asked why he had not prioritized his own survival. There was a pause. "I am sorry, Ambassador," Kowalski said, genuinely confused. "I do not understand the question." The ground campaign took 11 hours. By the end of it, the Marines had cleared every hive structure on the planet, and recovered 12,000 Solari civilians alive. The number was far higher than any projection had predicted, because the humans had moved so fast that the Vashran had not had time to execute their captives. 12,000 people who were alive because of a species that had been in this star system for less than a single day. Sci-Fi sat alone in his quarters that night and stared at the wall and tried to write his report, and found that his hands were shaking again. He was not afraid. Not exactly. What he felt was something older and deeper, something that sat in the place where his ancestors had once kept the emotions that the Aelori had engineered away thousands of years ago. He felt awe. And beneath the awe, like a stone at the bottom of a clear river, he felt the first stirring of a question that would haunt him for the rest of the campaign. What kind of species could do this? What kind of species could fight with this much fury and still stop to carry children out of the fire? What kind of species could hold that much violence and that much tenderness in the same pair of hands? The Vashran Dominion sent its first ever diplomatic communication to a species it considered lesser that evening. It was addressed directly to Admiral Ewan, and it contained only 4 words. What are you? Ewan read it on the bridge of his flagship. He smiled, thin and tired, and carrying the weight of everything his people had just done, and he did not respond. Sci-Fi understood the silence. The answer was not something that could be put into words. Every military doctrine he had ever studied, every war he had ever observed, every strategic model the Aelori had built over 9,000 years of galactic diplomacy said the same thing. After a major engagement, you stop. You consolidate your gains. You repair your ships. You tend to your wounded. You give your soldiers time to breathe and grieve and remember that they are alive. Admiral Ewan ordered the fleet to advance toward the Vashran homeworld within 48 hours. Sci-Fi requested a meeting with the Admiral and was politely declined. Ewan was busy. He was always busy. The entire fleet was always busy. The humans did not seem to have a setting between full stop and full speed, and they had apparently decided that full stop was not an option, while Solari civilians were still being held on other Vashran-occupied worlds. So Sci-Fi did what diplomats do when they cannot speak to the person in charge. He watched, he listened, he walked the corridors of the Thermopylae, and talked to anyone who would talk to him, and he began to assemble in his mind the thing he had come here to find. Not a tactical assessment, not a fleet analysis, not the kind of dry military intelligence that the Concord had sent him to collect. He was looking for the answer to a question that was much older and much more frightening. Why was the galaxy afraid of humans? It was not their technology. Their ships were good, but not extraordinary. The Orvani had better shielding. The Tuum had more powerful weapons. The Dreth had faster engines. Humanity sat comfortably in the middle of every technological ranking the Concord maintained. Impressive for a species that had only been in space for 3 centuries, but not exceptional. It was not their numbers. They had a large population, but the Vashran outnumbered them by a factor of 12, and the Tuum by a factor of 30. Humanity could not win a war of pure attrition against any of the elder species. Even their speed, although their speed was genuinely alarming, the 72-hour mobilization had shocked the galaxy. But speed alone did not inspire the kind of deep ancestral dread that Sci-Fi had seen in the eyes of delegates from a dozen different species when the word human was spoken in certain contexts. No, the thing that made the galaxy afraid was something else entirely, and Sci-Fi found it not in a battle or a briefing, but in the mess hall at 2 in the morning. He was sitting alone with a cup of something the humans called coffee, which tasted like burnt soil, but which he had grown strangely fond of. When a group of Marines sat down at the next table, they had just come off a 12-hour training rotation, and they were exhausted and loud and completely unaware that an alien diplomat was listening to every word they said. They talked about the battle. They talked about the Solari children they had pulled from the hive pens. One of them, a young man with a pilot, shaved head, and hands that were still bandaged from plasma burns, described carrying a Solari infant, who had been so badly malnourished that he could feel every bone in its body through its skin. His voice broke when he said this. The table went quiet for a moment. Then another Marine, an older woman with sergeant stripes and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone, reached across and put her hand on his arm and said, "That kid is alive because of you, and do not ever forget that." The young man nodded and wiped his eyes with the back of his bandaged hand. And then someone made a joke about the food, and they all laughed, and the conversation moved on. Sci-Fi sat very still and thought about what he had just witnessed. He thought about the Alori and how his people had, 6,000 years ago, made the decision to genetically suppress their fear responses. They had done this because fear was destabilizing, because it led to irrational decisions. Panic and violence. They had been right to do it, or so he had always believed. His people had not fought a war among themselves in 5,000 years. He thought about the Tuum, who had gone further and suppressed their aggression entirely. They were the most peaceful species in the Concord, and also the most passive, unable to act decisively, even when action was desperately needed. He thought about the Orvani, who had eliminated grief because they believed it served no evolutionary purpose. A species that could not mourn was a species that could never be paralyzed by loss. They were efficient and rational, and their suicide rate was the highest in the galaxy, because it turned out that a species that cannot grieve also cannot fully love. Every elder species in the Concord had done some version of this. They had looked at the raw, unfiltered chaos of sentient emotion and decided it was too dangerous to keep. They had trimmed themselves, pruned away the parts that hurt, down the edges that cut. They had done it to survive, to build stable civilizations, to prevent the kind of self-destruction that had claimed so many younger species. Humans had refused. Or perhaps they could not do it. Perhaps their biology was too stubborn, or their culture too attached to the full spectrum of what it meant to feel. Perhaps they had tried and failed, or perhaps they had looked at the choice and decided that the cost was too high. Either way, they had kept all of it. The rage and the grief and the love and the terror and the joy and the spite and the tenderness and the fury. They had kept every single piece of the emotional inheritance that evolution had given them, and instead of being torn apart by it, they had learned to use it. That was the thing behind their eyes. Sci-Fi spent the next 3 days conducting interviews. He talked to soldiers and engineers and pilots and medics and cooks, and the woman who cleaned the corridors on Deck 7. Every single one of them confirmed what he was beginning to understand. The best human soldiers were not the ones who felt nothing. They were the ones who felt the most. A pilot told him she flew better when she was angry, because the anger sharpened her focus to a razor point. A medic said he worked faster when he was grieving, because the grief reminded him that every second mattered. A Marine sergeant who had been in 6 combat deployments said that the thing that kept him moving when his body wanted to stop was love, plain and simple. Love for the people beside him and the people behind him and the people he had never met who were counting on him. They had turned the full unbroken spectrum of sentient feeling into a weapon, and no species that had traded away pieces of itself to achieve peace could match it. On the 4th night, Sci-Fi found Captain Morrow alone in her quarters. She was sitting at her desk with casualty reports spread across the screen, and her face was wet. She had been crying. She looked up when he entered, and she did not try to hide it. She did not apologize. She simply wiped her face with her sleeve and said, "What do you need, Ambassador?" "I need to understand something," he said. "Ask." "You are weeping for the dead." "Yes. In 30 minutes you will walk onto the bridge and give orders that may send more people to their deaths." "Yes." "How do you do both? How do you hold grief in one hand and command in the other?" Morrow looked at him for a long time, and he could see the answer forming behind her eyes before she spoke. "Because they are the same hand, Ambassador. I grieve because I command. I command because I grieve. If I could not feel the weight of every name on this list, I would have no business sending anyone into battle. The grief is not a weakness. It is the reason I fight hard enough to keep the list short. Sci-Fi left her quarters and stood alone. Corridor and pressed his back against the cold metal wall and closed his eyes. He understood now. Humans did not fight despite their emotions. They fought with them. They fought through them. They poured every ounce of love and rage and sorrow and hope into the act of war, and it made them something that the galaxy had never seen before. A species that burned with everything it had, that held nothing back, that threw itself into the fire and came out still burning. Every elder species had looked at the fire inside themselves and said, "This is too dangerous," and put it out. Humans had looked at the same fire and said, "This is who we are," and they had learned to aim it. Later that night he found Marl again. She was on the observation deck, alone, staring out at the stars that streaked past in long lines of blue and white. He stood beside her, and they were quiet together for a while. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I am thinking about the garden I want to plant when this is over. Tomatoes, probably. Maybe sunflowers." He stared at her. She stared at the void. And in that silence, Sci-Fi understood something that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The most dangerous creature in the galaxy was not the one that felt nothing. It was the one that could hold destruction and sunflowers in the same heart and keep walking forward. It was a massive planet, dark and swollen, covered in organic structures that rose from the surface in twisted spires so tall they pierced the upper atmosphere. The entire world was essentially one continuous hive, a living structure that housed billions of Vashran drones, and the Queen at its center, the ancient intelligence that had ordered the destruction of 3 Solari worlds without hesitation or remorse. The human fleet arrived at the edge of the system and stopped. 814 ships had left Sol space. 2 weeks of campaigning across the Solari frontier had reduced that number to 703. The missing ships were not all destroyed. Some were damaged and limping back to repair stations. Some were holding position over liberated worlds. But enough of them were gone forever that the fleet felt the absence like a missing tooth. Sci-Fi stood on the bridge of the Thermopylae and looked at the tactical display and felt his throat tighten. The Vashran had consolidated everything they had left into the defense of their homeworld. Fleet elements from across their entire dominion had been recalled, forming a defensive sphere of over 1,000 vessels around Chith Verik. The planet's surface bristled with weapons batteries, and the space around it was thick with drone swarms, so dense they showed up on sensors as a solid mass. This was the end. One way or another, this was where it finished. Admiral Ewan opened a fleet-wide channel, and his voice was calm and measured, and carried the weight of a decision that Sci-Fi knew had been keeping the man awake for days. "All ships, hold position. We are transmitting terms of surrender to the Vashran Dominion." Sci-Fi blinked. Surrender terms. He accessed the transmission and read it again, because he was certain he must be misunderstanding the language. The terms were generous, extraordinarily generous. The humans were offering to allow the Vashran Dominion to continue existing as a sovereign state. They would withdraw from Vashran space entirely once all Solari prisoners were released. They would not demand reparations. They would not occupy Vashran territory. They would not execute the Queen. All they asked was an end to the killing and the return of the people who had been taken. The Vashran Queen responded within the hour. Her message was broadcast on every frequency, and it dripped with contempt. She called the humans weak and sentimental. She said their mercy was proof that they lacked the will to finish what they had started. She said the Dominion would fight to the last drone, and that the humans would drown in their own soft-hearted foolishness. Sci watched Admiral Ewan read the response on his flagship. He watched the Admiral close his eyes for just a moment. And in that moment, Sci saw something cross the man's face that was not anger and not determination, but something closer to sorrow, the deep, heavy sorrow of a person who had hoped for one outcome and received another. Then Ewan opened his eyes and recorded his reply. His voice was quiet and steady, and it carried across every Voshran communication channel in the system. "We are giving you this chance, because we know what comes next if you refuse, and we do not want to do it. But we will. We have always been willing to do the things we do not want to do. That is what makes us what we are. You have 6 hours. The 6 hours passed. The Queen did not surrender. The Battle of Chithvarak began at dawn by Earth Standard Time. Not that dawn meant anything in the void of space. But the humans kept their clocks set to home, and there was something in that small detail that said everything about who they were. It was the largest military engagement in recorded galactic history. The Voshran fought with the blind ferocity of a species defending its queen and its world and its very existence. Everything they had at the human fleet. Waves of drones so thick they blotted out the stars. Capital ships that rammed human vessels at full speed. Weapons platforms that fired until their barrels melted and then fired some more. The humans took catastrophic damage in the first 6 hours. They lost 43 ships in the initial approach alone, and the casualty reports that scrolled across Sci-Fi's display were a steady stream of names and numbers that blurred together into a river of loss. They did not break. They did not retreat. They did not even slow down. Sci-Fi watched a destroyer called the Santiago take a hit that tore it nearly in half. The surviving crews sealed the breach sections and kept fighting from the half that still worked. He watched fighter pilots in crippled craft make the decision, calmly and deliberately, to aim their burning ships at Voshran dreadnoughts and accelerate. He watched Marines board a Voshran carrier through a hull breach, no wider than a doorway, and fight their way through the entire ship, deck by deck for 11 hours straight. On the second day, the human fleet broke through the orbital defense screen and began landing ground forces on Chithvarak itself. The Marines went into the hive tunnels, dark and winding passages filled with drones and traps, and the constant sound of chittering that came from everywhere and nowhere. They fought tunnel by tunnel, chamber by chamber, in conditions so close and so brutal that most of their advanced technology was useless, and it came down to rifles and hands and the willingness to keep moving forward into the dark. On the third day, a Marine company breached the Queen's inner sanctum. Sci-Fi watched the feed from the company commander's helmet camera. The chamber was vast, a cathedral of organic material pulsing with bioluminescence, and at its center was the Queen herself, enormous and ancient, and surrounded by her final guard of elite drones. The Marines fought through the guard in 20 minutes of violence so intense that the audio feed was nothing but a wall of sound. Then the company commander, a woman named Major Reyes, whose armor was cracked and whose visor was spattered with fluids that were not all her own, stood in front of the Queen with her weapon raised. The Queen looked at her with compound eyes that held the cold intelligence of a species that had ruled its corner of the galaxy for 10,000 years. "Kill me," the Queen said through a translator. "Finish this." Major Reyes lowered her weapon. "No," she said. "You are going to live. You are going to watch your people receive medical care from the species you tried to destroy. And you are going to sign a surrender that guarantees you will never touch the Solari again." The Queen stared at her for a long time. "Why?" she said. "I would not show you this mercy." Reyes looked at her, and something passed across her face. That was tired and sad and unbreakable, all at once. "I know," she said. "That is the difference between us." The war ended. The Voshran surrendered. Human medical teams moved across the planet's surface, treating wounded Vashran alongside their own casualties. Supply ships arrived, carrying food and water for the Solari prisoners, who were still being extracted from hive pens deep beneath the surface. Sethari watched all of it, and wrote it all down. And when the fleet finally turned for home, he sat in his quarters and composed the report that the Galactic Concord had sent him to write. 3 months later, he stood before the full assembly of the Concord and delivered his findings. The chamber was silent. 42 species waiting to hear what the old Aelori diplomat had learned about the humans. He spoke for an hour. He laid out the tactical analysis, the fleet capabilities, the mobilization doctrine, the technological assessments. Expected. All the dry military intelligence they had asked for. And then he set aside his notes and spoke from a place that his species had supposedly engineered away 6,000 years ago. "You asked me to observe humanity at war and explain what I found," he said. "Here is my answer. They are not the strongest species. They are not the most advanced. They do not have the best ships or the most refined tactics, although these things are formidable. What they have is something none of us possess any longer, because we were wise enough, or perhaps foolish enough, to give it away." He paused and looked across the chamber at the faces of beings who had shaped the galaxy for millennia. They have the full unbroken capacity to feel. They love so deeply that they will cross a galaxy for strangers. They grieve so fiercely that they will fight through wounds that should kill them. They rage with such purity that hive minds cannot predict them. And they fear. Oh, how they fear. They have learned to walk forward anyway. He took a breath that he did not technically need. Every world dreads them, not because they are monsters, but because they are everything we chose not to be, and they are magnificent. The chamber was quiet for a very long time. The Concord voted unanimously to reclassify humanity, not as a regional power, not as a galactic power, but under a new designation created specifically for them. A category that had never existed before, and that carried with it a weight that every species in the room understood. Apex Catalyst, a species around which the trajectory of galactic civilization bends. 6 months after the war ended, Sethari received a small package at his home on Aelor Prime. It had been shipped across 3 relay stations and bore the customs markings of the Sol system. Inside was a sealed envelope. He opened it and a handful of seeds fell into his palm. Small, striped, teardrop-shaped. Note, written in simple block letters. "For your garden. Even diplomats should grow something. E.M." He planted them in a ceramic pot on his balcony that overlooked the violet forests of his homeworld. He watered them every morning, and talked to them the way he had seen humans talk to growing things, with patience and hope and a quiet faith that something beautiful would emerge from the dirt. They grew tall and gold and utterly alien against the purple Aelori sky, bright faces turning toward the foreign sun as if they recognized it even here, even so far from home. Sethari tended his sunflowers every morning for the rest of his life. And every morning he thought about the species that carried war and sunflowers in the same trembling hands. And he understood at last why every world in the galaxy dreaded them. Not because of what they could destroy, but because of what they refused to let go of, even when the rest of the universe told them it was safer. To forget